Hello everybody, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about Tupac Shakur as a poet, and if you aren't familiar with him, he was also a famous rap artist, and so he was before your time, so you may not be familiar, but I really want to let you know that music can be poetry. This is one of our first steps in that. Before we get started on today's poem, I want to tell you a little bit about the man that wrote this poem. His name was Tupac Shakur, as I stated before, and he is known as one of the greatest rap artists of all time, still to this day. And he's passed by now, but he still gets credit for that. He came from a very rough upbringing. He was raised by a single mother, and they lived in poverty, and they moved all the time, and sometimes they even lived in homeless shelters. And in addition to that, his mother also had a drug addiction. So his life was very unpredictable, very unstable, probably very scary at times. Even though he moved a lot, an interesting fact is a lot of his time was spent in Harlem, New York, which is the same place as Langston Hughes. However, this was much more recent than Langston Hughes. He was actually in prison when she was pregnant with him. And so that just kind of tells you the rough start that he kind of had in life. As you can see, this is a very brief rundown of his life, but as you can see, he went through a lot. And one of his outlets for getting out those emotions that he had inside of them about his life was he wrote poetry. And he really found refuge or a safe place and through his writing. Despite all of his mother's struggles, she did manage to get him into a school of arts in Baltimore, Maryland, because she knew that he really enjoyed the arts, such as writing. And he was in his first play, and he actually realized he loved theater. And from there, he just grew. He became an actor in some movies, and he wrote poetry, but then he realized that he could rap his poetry, and he turned his poetry into rap, and he was very successful at it. Despite Tupac's success, his music was actually very controversial as well, and unfortunately, he did get caught up in drugs in his life. I would think as a result of the life that he led and some unfortunate events, he actually was shot and killed in a drive-by shooting incident when he was 25 years old. I tell you all of that information because it relates directly to this poem. Today's poem is called The Rose That Grew from Concrete. And before we go any further, I want you to think about the title and tell me what you think that this poem might possibly be about. Let's go ahead and hear the poem and read the poem, and then we will jump to our analysis. The Rose That Grew from Concrete by Tupac Shakur. Did you hear about the rose that grew from a crack in the concrete? Proving nature's law is wrong, it learned to walk without having feet. Funny it seems, but by keeping its dreams, it learned to breathe fresh air. Long live the rose that grew from concrete when no one else ever cared. So if we didn't take our time analyzing this poem and we just read through it once, we would think that it was literally about a rose that grew from a crack in the concrete. However, it has a figurative meaning. And when Tupac wrote down this poem, below the title he put autobiographical. And if you look up autobiographical, it is of a written work or dealing with the writer's own life. So he is saying this poem is about his life. So that tells me that the rose and the concrete and that crack in the sidewalk all are symbolic of something in his life. So let's break it down together and see if we can make sense of this. If I go to the first line, did you hear about the rose that grew from a crack in the concrete? The first thing I want to talk about is a rose. When I think of roses, I think they are symbolic of love. They are a thing of beauty. And if they grew from a crack in the concrete is cement. And typically, if we think of a flower thriving, we think of it being in healthy soil, in the sunlight, in a safe place away from where people are walking. But the irony in this is that the rose is growing from a crack in the concrete. I don't know about you, but when I'm walking down the sidewalk sometimes it can be rare to even see weeds growing in there because they get stepped on, they get trampled on. And so if a beautiful rose were growing in a crack in the concrete, that would be very unexpected. It would be something that really made me stop and admire, because I would never expect it to thrive without healthy soil nourishing it. So here, right away, I'm going to tell you that the rose is symbolic of him. It's symbolic of Tupac. And he grew from a crack in the concrete. So that what that tells me is he thinks of himself as something that he may not be necessarily saying beauty, but a beautiful life. If I think of concrete, I think of it being hard. I think of it being rough. I think of people trampling on it. It gets dirty. And I mentioned before, it doesn't have nourishing soil. And so I think the concrete is symbolic of Tupac's life. It may have been rough. It may have been hard. He may have felt like at times he was getting walked all over. He may have been dirty. So when I think deeply about this, I think that he is saying even though he had a rough life and rough upbringing, people may not have expected him to thrive. They may not have expected him to grow up and have a life of beauty. But he did. He was like a rose growing from a crack in the concrete. Proving nature's law is wrong. It learned to walk without having any feet. I believe that when he's talking about nature's law, I think he's talking about in nature, a rose really and truly could not grow and survive and thrive from a crack in the concrete. Basically, if a rose were growing in the sidewalk, we would have little expectation for it actually surviving. And I believe that that is symbolic of what the people that knew him growing up, or society knowing his circumstances, wouldn't necessarily have very high expectations for him to grow up and be successful and have a life of beauty. Yet there he was without having feet. Now, literally he had feet, but figuratively, feet support us. They keep us grounded. And so he didn't have that support. He kind of probably felt like maybe he had to raise himself. He didn't have parents that were capable of doing that for him. And so he had to grow up without having that support. Funny it seems, but by keeping its dreams, it learned to breathe fresh air. This actually reminds me of a dream deferred. He didn't give up on those dreams despite his situation. He kept chasing that dream, and it learned to breathe fresh air. When I think of fresh air, I think of a new start. I think of not only surviving, but thriving. I think of finding success. And he's saying, despite all of that, he did find success. He was able to breathe fresh air. Long live the rose that grew from concrete when no one else ever cared. I believe there he's saying long live. I think he was anticipating of living a successful life, living a long life, being kind of legendary where he leaves a legacy behind. Of course, he did get killed when he was only 25 years old. However, he is still known as one of the greatest rap artists to this day, and so his legacy does still live on. And he's saying that it grew from concrete when no one else ever cared. So he found the wherewithal within him. He found the perseverance within him. He found the drive within him to overcome all odds, all expectations, and make the best of his life that he possibly could, despite everything around him, despite feeling that nobody even cared. Now, before we mention personification, and just quickly I will review, personification is when you give something that is non-human person-like qualities. And one of the examples I gave you are a lot of cartoons. You see animals singing, dancing, talking, and that is personification. They aren't really able to do those things, so you give them person-like qualities. So in this poem, I want you to think about what is the personification. What do we give human-like qualities, or we treat it like a human, even though it's not? In this case, it is the rose. The rose is proving nature's law wrong. It's learned to walk without having feet. Now, roses don't walk, and so that's all personification. To take this poem even further, I'm going to play a video of Tupac talking about this poem, and he adds a little bit more perspective that I think that makes you think a little bit more deeply about the content of the poem.
Why the rose that grew from the concrete had damaged petals. On the contrary, we would all celebrate its tenacity. We would all love its will to reach the sun. Well, we are the roses. This is the concrete. These are my damaged petals. Don't ask me why. Ask me how.
I think that's very powerful because he is correct. If we saw a rose growing from concrete, we wouldn't think twice about its damage on its petals because we would think it's a pure miracle that it survived in the first place. So he's asking, why is it different with people? He's like, don't ask me why. Don't ask me why I'm damaged. Don't ask me why I have issues. Ask me how. Ask me how I survived, how I overcame all odds, and how I defied nature's law. In an earlier lesson, I had asked you, where do you think poetry is in the world? And I think we've learned, or a lot of your answers knew that it was all around us. You just weren't sure where. So I have two commercials for you that actually chose this poem, The Rose That Grew from Concrete, as the poem to be used in their commercial. One is for Ford and the other is for Powerade. I'm going to show you the Ford commercial today, and I'm going to put it in Edpuzzle, and I'm going to save the Powerade commercial for tomorrow's lesson. If you need to rewatch that commercial to answer these questions, I did post it into Google Classroom, but I would like to ask you, what is Ford's implied message about this car? Why did they choose that poem for this car? Sorry, Winston's tired, so he wants held. So he's going to sit in on the last part of our lesson. So thank you for your patience with that. So I have one task that I would like for you to do. I would like for you to write a poem, and I have a template for you in Google Classroom, and you have two options. You can write about success in unusual circumstances. It could be real, it could be made up, it could be about you, it could be about somebody else, or you could write a poem about the that grew from You're not going to write about the rose that grew from concrete, but you could write about anything else and fill in those blanks. I have left examples from past students in Google Classroom. It's if you scroll down on the template to give you an idea of some things that you could write about. But again, I want it to be your creation, and I do expect effort out of it. Take your time, and I do expect quality. I don't expect perfection. I know you are not a professional poet, but I do expect effort. So have fun with it and get as creative as you want. Tomorrow, we will look at the Powerade commercial and move forward. Have a great day. Despite all of his others, nature's law. So basically, if a rose were going even further, have you or someone, and I'm going to put the video in Edpuzzle, like learning to walk without feet. Thanks.